Elena's smile was a cruel, confident slash of red across her face as her lawyer laid out their demands. She believed I was broken, penniless, a man with nothing left to lose because he'd already lost it all. She filed for divorce thinking I had nothing. But then my lawyer began to speak, and the judge's face said everything. To understand the profound, shattering silence that fell over that courtroom, you have to understand the silence that had already consumed my life for the past 10 years. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the quiet of things left unsaid, of dreams eroding, of a gulf widening between two people who once promised each other forever. My name is Thomas, and for most of my adult life, I was a carpenter. It's a simple word for a complex thing. I didn't just nail boards together. I gave shape to wood, listened to its grain, and coaxed it into becoming a cabinet, a staircase, a home. My hands were my trade. They were calloused and often stained with oil or varnish, a fact Elena had once found charming but had grown to see as a mark of my station, a station she felt was far beneath her. We had been married for a decade. In the beginning, it was good. Or at least, my memory had painted it that way. She was vibrant, ambitious, working in marketing with a fire in her eyes that I mistook for passion for life. I saw it as a compliment to my own quieter, more grounded nature. She was the wind, and I was the tree. For a time, the wind made the tree's leaves dance, but eventually, the wind only wants to uproot the tree and move on. Her world was one of networking events, glossy magazines, and the constant, gnawing hunger for more. More status, more money, a more impressive-sounding life. My world was the scent of sawdust in the morning, the satisfaction of a perfect dovetail joint, and the steady, reliable rhythm of work. I earned a decent living. It was honest. We were never hungry, always had a roof over our heads. A very good roof, in fact, because I'd built it myself. The house was my masterpiece, constructed on a piece of land my grandparents had left me. I poured my soul into that house, long before Elena ever set foot in it. Every beam, every floorboard was a testament to my own strength and patience. To her, it was just an asset, a backdrop for the life she wanted to project. The most important person in my world, aside from the woman I thought I loved, was my father, Arthur. He was a retired history professor, a man whose mind had once been a sprawling, beautiful library of facts and stories. Now, that library was slowly, cruelly being dismantled by dementia. Early onset, a brutal diagnosis that had shifted my world on its axis. He was my dad. He had raised me alone after my mother passed, taught me about integrity, about the quiet dignity of being a good man. Caring for him wasn't a choice, it was a reflex, as natural as breathing. This became the central friction of my marriage. To me, spending my evenings helping Dad with his meals, organizing his medications, or just sitting with him as he drifted between past and present was an act of love. To Elena, it was an inconvenience, a drain on our resources, a black hole that sucked up the time and money she felt should be invested in us, which really meant in her. "He's taking up all your energy, Thomas," she would say, her voice tight with a frustration she barely tried to conceal. "We never go out anymore. All you do is work and then go play nurse to him." I tried to explain. I tried to make her see the man he was, the man he still was, underneath the fog. But she looked at my father and saw only a liability, a stain on the perfect, upwardly mobile life she was trying to curate. The chasm between us grew with every doctor's appointment I attended. Every weekend I spent fixing something at his small apartment instead of attending one of her work galas. The breaking point, the moment the frayed cord of our marriage finally snapped, came on my father's 70th birthday. It was a milestone I was determined to celebrate, despite his condition. I knew a large, noisy party would overwhelm him, so I planned a small, quiet dinner at our home. Just a few people. Me, Elena, my father, and, regrettably, Elena's brother, Marcus. Marcus was a slicker, more overtly arrogant version of his sister. He worked in finance, or wealth management, as he called it, and carried himself with the unearned confidence of a man who believed his net worth was a direct measure of his human worth. He looked at me, the carpenter, with a kind of amused condescension, as if I were a quaint relic from a bygone era. The evening started with a fragile peace. Dad was having a good day. He was lucid, his eyes clear. He told a story about his time at the university, and for a few minutes, he was the brilliant, funny man I grew up adoring. I saw the flicker of his true self, and it filled my chest with a warmth that almost pushed back the encroaching dread. I had cooked his favorite meal, a simple roast chicken. The table was set. Everything was, for a moment, okay. Then it happened. As I was clearing the plates, Dad reached for his glass of red wine. His hand trembled, a common symptom of his medication. The glass tipped, and a dark crimson stain bloomed across the white tablecloth Elena had insisted we use. It spread like a wound. Silence fell, thick and immediate. My first instinct was concern. "Dad, are you okay? Don't worry about it. It's just a spill." But Elena's reaction was not concern. It was a detonation. Her face, which had been arranged in a mask of strained tolerance, contorted with pure, unadulterated fury. "Oh, for God's sake," she hissed, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Look what he's done. I knew this was a mistake. This is why I didn't want him here." I froze, my hand hovering over the table. The cruelty in her tone was stunning. She wasn't speaking to me. She was performing for her brother, validating a shared worldview that saw my father as a problem to be managed. Marcus, never one to miss a cue, leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. "Honestly, Thomas, this is getting ridiculous. When are you going to do the sensible thing and put him in a home? The man is a liability. He's ruining your life. And Elena's tablecloth." He chuckled, as if he'd made a clever joke. Rage, cold and pure, surged through me. It was a foreign feeling. I was a patient man, a calm man. But this was different. This was my father. "That's enough, Marcus," I said, my voice dangerously low. "He's my father. Show some respect." Elena stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. Her anger, now redirected, found its true target, me. "Respect?" She spat the word like it was poison. "You want respect for him. What about respect for me, Thomas? For our life? All you do is cater to that senile old man. You care more about him than you do about me, about our future, about this house he just ruined." "It's a tablecloth, Elena," I shot back, my voice rising. "He had an accident." "It's not about the tablecloth," she shrieked, her control completely gone. "It's about everything. It's about you choosing him over me, over and over again. I am done. I am so done living like this, being second place to a man who doesn't even know what day it is." And then she delivered the final devastating blow. She looked past me, directly at my father. He had been sitting silently through the exchange, his face a canvas of confusion and fear. But in that moment, as her hateful words landed, a flicker of terrible, heartbreaking clarity returned to his eyes. He understood. He understood every ounce of her contempt. His shoulders slumped, and the light in his eyes went out, replaced by a deep, profound shame. He looked smaller, wounded to his very soul. Seeing that look on my father's face was like a physical blow. Something inside me snapped. The last thread of affection, of loyalty, of hope for my marriage, disintegrated into ash. The love I had for Elena died in that instant, murdered by her cruelty. The rest of the evening was a blur of quiet, awful logistics. Marcus, looking slightly alarmed at the sheer venom his sister had unleashed, made a hasty exit. Elena grabbed her purse and keys. "I'm staying at Marcus's," she said, her voice cold and devoid of any emotion. "Don't call me." She walked out without a backward glance. I was left alone in the dining room with my father and the ugly red stain on the table. He wouldn't look at me. He just stared at his hands, his face etched with a sorrow that was all the more painful for its lucidity. "I'm sorry, son," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm so sorry. I made a mess." My heart broke. I knelt beside his chair and took his hand. "No, Dad. You did nothing wrong. Nothing. This is not your fault." I spent the next hour calming him, assuring him, before I carefully drove him back to his own apartment. I helped him get ready for bed, waiting until his breathing was deep and even, until the troubled lines on his forehead had smoothed out. When I returned to the house I had built, it was dark and silent. The air was thick with the ghosts of the words that had been said. Elena was gone. The stain was still on the table, a dark accusation. I walked through the rooms, touching the door frames I had sanded, looking at the floors I had laid. This place was supposed to be a sanctuary, a home, but it had become a battleground, and my father, the person I was sworn to protect, had become a casualty. I sat down in the living room, in the dark. I didn't turn on a light. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of her contempt, her ambition, her utter lack of empathy. It was a suffocating, heavy thing, and in that suffocating silence, a decision formed within me. It wasn't a hot, angry decision. It was cold, clear, and absolute. This was over. My marriage was over. My life with Elena was over. But I would not be the victim she saw me as. I would not be the pathetic, downtrodden man she and her brother had mocked. She thought she was leaving me. She thought she was in control. She was wrong. She had started a war, but I would be the one to finish it, and it would be finished on my terms. The next morning, I packed a bag, not with anger or haste, but with a strange, methodical calm. I took my work clothes, some personal effects, and the old photo of my mother and father that I kept on my nightstand. I loaded them into my truck. I didn't leave a note. There was nothing left to say. I drove to my father's apartment and let myself in. He was sitting in his armchair, looking out the window, a lost expression on his face. "I'm staying here for a while, Dad," I said, putting my hand on his shoulder. "Full time. Just you and me." A faint smile touched his lips. He didn't ask why. Maybe he knew. Maybe he didn't. It didn't matter. I was where I needed to be. The first few days were a strange kind of limbo. I called my clients and told them I was taking a personal leave of absence. I focused entirely on my father, establishing a new routine, a rhythm of care and quiet companionship. I cooked for him, read to him from his history books, and took him for slow walks in the park when he was up to it. Being away from the house, away from the constant, oppressive weight of Elena's disapproval, was like coming up for air after being held underwater for too long. The physical separation created a mental distance, and from that new vantage point, I began to see my marriage with a brutal, unflinching clarity. My mind became a retrospective, replaying the last 10 years, not as a love story, but as a case study in manipulation. I started to connect the dots, to see the pattern I had been too blind or too willing to ignore. I remembered the jokes she made at dinner parties about my calloused hands. "Thomas could build you a table," she'd say with a laugh, "but don't ask him to pick out the wine." It was always framed as a charming quirk, but now I could hear the undertone of embarrassment, of apology for my lack of sophistication. I remembered the argument we had 3 years ago. My father's roof had been leaking badly, and the estimate for repairs was several $1,000s. I had a savings account, money I'd put aside from side jobs over the years. Elena had wanted to use it for a trip to Italy. "We deserve a vacation, Thomas, a real one," she had argued. When I told her the money had to go to my father's roof, her disappointment had curdled into a cold resentment that lasted for weeks. "It's always him," she'd said. "That money was for us." Now I realized, when she said us, she meant her. I thought about the way she dismissed my work. She never called it a career. It was my hobby or my little business. She talked about my passion for woodcraft as if it were a quaint but ultimately insignificant pastime, like collecting stamps. The pride I took in my work, the identity I had built with my own 2 hands, was something she couldn't comprehend because it didn't come with a fancy title or a 6-figure salary. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't something she could boast about to her friends. It all clicked into place, forming a mosaic of disdain. Her love hadn't been conditional. It had been transactional. I was a component in the life she was building, and when I ceased to serve my purpose, when my devotion to my father became a bigger liability than my utility as a husband, my value plummeted to 0. The birthday dinner wasn't an isolated incident. It was the inevitable culmination of 1,000 smaller betrayals, 1,000 moments of quiet contempt. A week after I moved out, Elena called. Her tone was not apologetic. It was businesslike. "I assume you're not coming back," she said, her voice flat. "That's a safe assumption," I replied, my own voice calm. "Fine," she said. "My lawyer will be in touch. I'm keeping the house, Thomas. You can have your father." The line went dead. The cruelty of her final words, the way she equated my father to a piece of furniture I could have, solidified my resolve into something as hard as diamond. A few days later, I decided to go back to the house to retrieve the last of my things, specifically my tools and some personal documents I kept in my workshop in the garage. I timed my visit for a weekday when I knew she'd be at work. Letting myself in with my old key felt like a transgression. The house was cold and unnervingly tidy. All traces of me, my jacket on the hook, my work boots by the door, were gone. It was as if I had been surgically removed. My workshop was my sanctuary, the one place that was truly mine. It smelled of cedar and oil and sweat. It was organized chaos. As I was packing my chisels and saws, my hand brushed against an old, dusty metal file box, tucked away on a high shelf, hidden behind stacks of lumber. I'd completely forgotten about it. It had been my grandfather's. He had given it to me on my 18th birthday, along with a key. "Don't open it until you need to, Tommy," he had said, his voice raspy. "This is for later. This is for building something that lasts." I had assumed he meant it metaphorically, and had put it away, the key tucked into a small tin with old screws and nails. Curiosity piqued. I rummaged through the tin, my fingers finding the small, ornate brass key. With a click, the old lock on the box sprang open. I lifted the lid. Inside, there was no treasure, no gold bars or stacks of cash. It was filled with papers, deeds, legal documents, and a thick, leather-bound ledger. It was a portfolio. My grandfather, the man I remembered as a simple farmer who loved the land, had been something more. He had been a quiet, preternaturally shrewd investor in that very land. Over decades, he had bought up parcels all over the state, undeveloped tracts, farmland, waterfront lots, all held within a trust. I sat down on a dusty stool, my heart pounding in my chest as I read the letter from the trust administrators, a quiet, old-school law firm in the city. The trust was structured to be managed by them until I reached my 40th birthday. Upon that date, full control and ownership of all assets would transfer to me. My 40th birthday had been 6 months ago. I had been so consumed with my father's deteriorating health and my crumbling marriage that I'd barely even registered the milestone. I had ignored the official-looking letters from the law firm, assuming they were junk mail. At the back of the file box was a recent valuation statement. I unfolded the paper, my hands trembling slightly. The numbers stared back at me, clinical and stark. The total value of the land holdings conservatively estimated was substantial. It was a life-changing amount of money. More money than I had ever imagined I would see. A safety net woven by a man who had been gone for 20 years. For building something that lasts, he had said. He hadn't meant a house. He had meant a life, a future, security for my father. I sat there in the dusty silence of my workshop, the document in my hand, feeling a strange mix of shock and a slow dawning, electrifying sense of power. I had never told Elena about this, not out of secrecy or malice, but because it was a private, sacred thing. It was a connection to my grandfather, a quiet promise for the future. It was my emergency fund, my someday plan to ensure my father would have the best care money could buy, no matter what. And in her relentless pursuit of a superficial lifestyle, Elena had never once been curious enough about my family or my past to even know it existed. She saw me as a simple carpenter, and I had let her. As I was about to close the box, my eyes caught something else I'd tossed in there in my haste to clean up. The contents of the kitchen trash can, which I'd emptied before I left. On top of the pile were the torn, shredded remains of several documents. Elena must have thrown them out, thinking I would never see them. Driven by a new, sharp-edged suspicion, I carefully pieced the strips of paper together on my workbench. They were bank statements for an account I didn't recognize. With painstaking patience, I taped the pieces together. The picture that emerged was sickeningly clear. For the last 2 years, Elena had been making large, regular transfers from our joint checking account to this secret account, thousands of dollars every month. The total was staggering. She had been systematically draining our shared resources, building a secret nest egg for her escape. The betrayal was no longer just emotional. It was financial, calculated, and predatory. She wasn't just leaving a marriage. She was executing a planned demolition of my life, intending to leave me with nothing but the rubble. All the grief, all the sadness I'd felt over my failed marriage instantly evaporated. It was replaced by a feeling I had never experienced before, a cold, hard, righteous anger. This was no longer a personal tragedy. It was an act of war. She had underestimated me. She had dismissed me. She had tried to defraud me. She thought she was holding all the cards, but I was holding an inheritance she couldn't even fathom, and she had just handed me the one weapon I needed to protect it. My resolve solidified. This wasn't just a divorce anymore. This was a reckoning. The first call I made was not to a divorce lawyer. It was to the law firm that managed my grandfather's trust. I spoke with a senior partner, a man named Mr. Harrington, who had known my grandfather personally. His voice was warm and professional. "Thomas, we've been trying to reach you," he said. "We were beginning to get worried. Your grandfather would be very proud of the man you've become." I spent an hour on the phone with him, getting a full and detailed understanding of the assets I now controlled. The reality of it was staggering, almost too vast to comprehend. But I didn't let the numbers overwhelm me. I saw them for what they were, not a lottery ticket, but armor. My next step was to find legal representation. I knew Elena would have a shark, someone expensive and aggressive from the kind of firm she admired. I didn't want a shark. I wanted a hunter, someone meticulous, patient, and thorough. I spent days in the local library, using their computers to research family law attorneys. I read reviews, case histories, and legal articles. I wasn't looking for the flashiest website or the biggest billboard. I was looking for a specific mindset. I found him in a small, unassuming office downtown. His name was David Chen. He wasn't a household name. His practice was small, but his reputation, in the circles that mattered, was that of a forensic genius. He was known for his almost obsessive attention to detail and his calm, methodical approach to dismantling complex financial deceptions. He was exactly what I needed. I scheduled a consultation. I walked into his office with my grandfather's file box under one arm and the taped-together bank statements in a folder. David was a man of about 50, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He listened without interruption as I laid out the entire story, from the decade of quiet dismissals to the birthday dinner fiasco to the discovery in the workshop. I didn't editorialize or embellish. I just gave him the facts. When I finished, I pushed the documents across his desk, the trust valuation and Elena's secret bank statements. He picked up the valuation first, his eyebrows rising slightly as he read the figure. Then he examined the shredded statements, a grim, focused look on his face. He was silent for a long time, just looking at the paper. Finally, he looked up at me, and a slow, thin smile spread across his face. It wasn't a smile of mirth. It was the smile of a chess master who sees the entire board and has just spotted his opponent's fatal flaw. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Your wife has made a critical error. She believes she is playing a game against a pawn, when in fact, she is facing a king. She is walking into a bear trap of her own design." That was the moment I knew I had found my ally. We agreed to work together. David's strategy was simple and brilliant. Do nothing, or rather, appear to do nothing. "She is overconfident," he explained. "Arrogance is a powerful weapon, but it's a double-edged sword. It makes people blind. We are going to let her believe she has already won. We will let her build her case on a foundation of lies, and at the precise right moment, we will pull the entire foundation out from under her." The first volley came a week later. A courier delivered a thick envelope to my father's apartment. It was the official divorce petition from Elena's lawyer. I read it with David over the phone. It was a masterpiece of fiction. She painted me as a financially reckless and irresponsible husband, a man who had squandered marital assets on his ailment-ridden father, leaving her with no choice but to end the marriage to protect her own financial future. She claimed I was emotionally distant and that my obsession with my father constituted abandonment. The petition demanded the house, which she listed as our primary marital asset, be awarded to her in its entirety, along with 10 years of significant spousal support to maintain the lifestyle to which she had become accustomed. "It's perfect," David said, a note of satisfaction in his voice. "She's locking herself into a narrative we can systematically dismantle. Do not respond. Do not contest. Your silence will be her confirmation." So I remained silent. I followed David's instructions to the letter. We began our own covert investigation. David filed subpoenas for the full records of Elena's secret bank account. The results were even more damning than I'd imagined. The account was not just in her name, it was a joint account with her brother Marcus. David's team then went further, subpoenaing email records between the two of them. What we found was sickening. There were dozens of emails going back more than a year. They referred to me as the Carpenter, or the Charity Case. They discussed their plan in detail. Marcus had advised her on how much money to siphon each month. They mocked my devotion to my father. One email from Marcus was particularly vile. Just keep playing the part of the dutiful wife for a few more months. Once the nest egg is big enough, you can drop the dead weight. We'll make sure he walks away with nothing but his toolbox and his senile old man. Reading those words should have hurt, but I felt nothing but a cold, clarifying anger. It was the final proof I needed. This wasn't a marriage that had failed. It was a long con that was reaching its conclusion. To reinforce Elena's narrative, I made a show of my supposed financial ruin. I sold my old, beloved work truck, a vehicle that was practically a part of me. I told the few mutual acquaintances who asked that I needed the money to pay for my father's mounting medical bills and to make ends meet. The news, as I knew it would, got back to Elena. She called me a few days after I sold the truck. Her voice was dripping with a sickly, false pity that made my stomach turn. "Thomas, I heard you sold your truck. I'm so sorry things are so difficult for you," she cooed. "Listen, my lawyer says you haven't responded to the petition. I don't want to drag this out and make it harder for you. It's better for everyone if we just get this over with quickly. For your sake, just sign the papers. Let's be done with it." "I'm considering my options, Elena," I said, keeping my voice weary and defeated. "There are no options, Thomas," she said, the pity evaporating, replaced by a sharp edge of impatience. "You have nothing. Sign the papers, or I will take you for everything you don't even have." I hung up the phone, my heart beating steadily. The trap was set. She was arrogant, she was greedy, and she was completely, utterly blind to the reality of the situation. She was marching confidently towards her own destruction, and I was going to let her. David and I spent the next few weeks preparing. We had depositions, valuations of the trust assets, and expert testimony lined up. We built our case in secret, a silent, powerful machine of facts and evidence, ready to be switched on. The day of the hearing was set. The stage was ready for the final act. The day of the hearing dawned gray and overcast, the sky the color of slate. It matched the cold knot of anxiety and anticipation in my stomach. I dressed carefully, not in a way to impress, but to fit the role I had been assigned. I wore a simple dark gray suit, one I'd bought off the rack at a department store. It was clean, it was neat, but it was unremarkable. I looked exactly like what Elena's petition claimed I was, a simple, working-class man, out of his depth and on the verge of financial ruin. I met David Chen in the lobby of the courthouse. He gave me a firm, reassuring nod. "Remember, Thomas," he said, his voice low. "Say nothing. Let them build their stage. We just provide the trapdoor." We entered the courtroom. It was a sterile, impersonal space, all polished wood and institutional lighting that seemed to bleach the color out of everything. Elena was already there, sitting beside her lawyer at the petitioner's table. She was the picture of aggrieved sophistication. She wore an expensive-looking cream-colored suit, her hair perfectly styled, her makeup immaculate. She looked less like a woman going through a divorce and more like a CEO about to close a hostile takeover. She glanced at me as I entered, her expression a carefully constructed mask of pity and sorrow. It was a masterful performance. In the gallery behind her sat her brother Marcus. He caught my eye and gave me a slow, smug smirk, an expression that said, "Game over." We took our seats. The air in the room was thick with tension. The judge, a stern-looking woman named Judge Albright, entered and the proceedings began. Elena's lawyer, a man named Peterson with a booming voice and an air of theatrical self-importance, stood to present their case. He began by painting a tragic portrait of his client, Elena Miller, a successful, vibrant woman who had been forced to make the heartbreaking decision to leave her husband of 10 years. "Your Honor," Peterson began, his voice resonating through the quiet room, Mrs. Miller comes to this court not with malice, but with a heavy heart. For years, she has supported her husband, Mr. Miller, both emotionally and, increasingly, financially. She has stood by as he has gradually withdrawn from their marriage, dedicating all of his time, energy, and, most critically, their shared financial resources to the care of his ailing parent. He paced in front of the judge's bench, a portrait of righteous indignation. While Mrs. Miller has nothing but sympathy for Mr. Miller's father, his son's single-minded devotion has come at the cost of their marital partnership. Their savings have been depleted. Their future, once bright, has been mortgaged to pay for elder care that has left them on the brink of insolvency. Mr. Miller, a carpenter by trade, has seen his already modest income dwindle as he has neglected his business. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting on the table in front of me. I kept my expression neutral, my eyes focused on a point on the far wall. I could feel Elena's eyes on me, watching for a reaction, but I gave her nothing. Peterson then moved to the specifics. The primary marital asset, Your Honor, is the family home, valued at approximately $750,000. Given that Mr. Miller has effectively abandoned the marriage and has proven himself to be financially irresponsible, we petition the court to award the house to Mrs. Miller as her sole and separate property. This is the only way to ensure she is not left destitute by her husband's choices. He wasn't finished. Furthermore, given the decade-long marriage and the disparity in their earning potential, Mrs. Miller being a successful marketing executive and Mr. Miller being a carpenter, we are petitioning for spousal support in the amount of $5,000 a month for a period of 10 years. This will allow Mrs. Miller to maintain the standard of living established during the marriage, a standard Mr. Miller's recent actions have jeopardized. He concluded with a flourish, gesturing towards Elena, who lowered her head at the perfect moment, a single crocodile tear tracing a path down her cheek. All Mrs. Miller asks for is a chance to rebuild her life. She asks for what is fair. She asks for justice. Peterson sat down, looking immensely pleased with himself. The narrative was set. The picture was painted. I was the irresponsible, financially incompetent villain. Elena was the long-suffering victim. The judge looked over at our table, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Chen," she said, "your response?" This was the moment. David Chen stood up, his movements calm and deliberate. He buttoned his suit jacket. He was the physical opposite of Peterson, quiet, understated, radiating an aura of unshakable competence. "Thank you, Your Honor," he began, his voice clear and even. "We have no objection to the dissolution of the marriage. My client, Mr. Miller, agrees that it is irrevocably broken." I saw a flicker of triumph in Elena's eyes. She thought we were capitulating. Her lawyer shifted in his seat, a confident smile playing on his lips. "However," David continued, the word hanging in the air, "we do have some significant corrections to the petitioner's assessment of the marital financial landscape. Mr. Peterson's portrayal of my client's financial irresponsibility is, to put it mildly, a work of fiction." Peterson shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is being argumentative." "Overruled," Judge Albright said, her eyes now fixed on David. "Continue, Mr. Chen." David gave a slight nod. "Mr. Peterson claims my client has depleted the marital assets. In fact, the opposite is true. For the past 24 months, it is the petitioner, Mrs. Miller, who has been systematically draining funds from their joint accounts." He walked to the clerk and handed over a thick binder. "Your Honor, these are the subpoenaed bank statements for a private account held at a different financial institution, an account my client was not aware of. The account is held jointly by Mrs. Elena Miller and her brother, Mr. Marcus Thorne." The room became utterly silent. I risked a glance at Elena. The color was draining from her face. Her mask of sorrow was gone, replaced by a flicker of panic. Her lawyer, Peterson, looked utterly bewildered, shuffling through his own papers as if hoping to find an explanation. "As you will see," David went on, his tone relentlessly factual, "the records show monthly transfers from the Miller's joint account into this secret account. The total amount transferred over 2 years is $217,400. A collective gasp went through the small gallery. Marcus, who had been leaning back with his arms crossed, was now sitting bolt upright, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. Furthermore, David said, his voice dropping slightly, building the drama, we have evidence that this was not simply a matter of setting aside personal funds. This was a coordinated, premeditated effort to defraud my client. He produced another binder. These are subpoenaed emails between Mrs. Miller and her brother. In these communications, they openly discuss their plan to strip him of his assets and leave him with, and I quote, nothing but his toolbox. The silence in the courtroom was now so profound it felt like a physical pressure. Every eye was on Elena. She looked from David to the judge, her mouth slightly agape, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her in real time. But David wasn't done. He saved the masterstroke for last. Finally, Your Honor, to the matter of my client's financial situation, which has been so dramatically misrepresented. While Mrs. Miller and her counsel have painted Mr. Miller as a man of modest, even insufficient means, this is a fundamental misunderstanding of the facts. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. My client, Thomas Miller, is the sole beneficiary of the Arthur Miller Sr. Generational Trust, established by his late grandfather. He gained full control of this trust 6 months ago. David walked calmly to the judge's bench and slid a single, laminated document across the polished wood. It was the official valuation portfolio of the trust's assets. Judge Albright picked up the paper. She held it, reading. Her eyes, which had been stern and impassive, widened almost imperceptibly. She read it again, as if to be sure. Then, she slowly lifted her head. She looked at the document. She looked at me, the simple carpenter in the cheap suit. Then her gaze shifted to Elena, whose face was now a ghastly shade of white. The judge's expression was no longer unreadable. It was a mixture of utter shock, dawning comprehension, and cold, judicial fury. The power in the room had not just shifted. It had undergone a seismic reversal. The trapdoor had been sprung, and Elena was in free fall. The judge placed the valuation document down on her bench with a quiet finality. She took off her glasses, polished them slowly, and put them back on, her eyes never leaving Elena. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Elena's lawyer, Peterson, looked like a man who had just been told the world was flat after he'd circumnavigated it. He was flipping through his notes, his face flushed, whispering urgently to Elena, who seemed incapable of hearing him. She was frozen, her eyes wide with a horror that was only just beginning to dawn. Mrs. Miller, Judge Albright finally said, her voice dangerously calm. It was the kind of calm that precedes a hurricane. The court is looking at evidence of systematic, long-term financial deception. It is looking at authenticated communications in which you and your brother conspire to commit what appears to be a clear case of marital fraud. And it is looking at a financial portfolio that suggests your husband's net worth is conservatively 100 times what you have claimed. Before we proceed any further, I want to offer you an opportunity to explain. Elena's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She looked helplessly at her lawyer, who could only shake his head, his own confidence completely shattered. Let's start with the undeclared bank account, the judge continued, her voice hardening. Can you explain these regular transfers, Mrs. Miller? Transfers totaling over $200,000 taken from marital funds without your husband's knowledge or consent? Elena finally found her voice, but it was thin and reedy, a pale imitation of her usual commanding tone. It was a loan, she stammered, clutching at the first straw she could find. A loan to my brother, for his business. I was going to pay it back. David Chen, who had remained standing, interjected smoothly. A loan, Your Honor. A loan that, in an email dated April 14th of last year, the petitioner and her brother refer to as Phase 1 of the exit plan? Without waiting for a response, David gestured to a large screen that had been set up in the courtroom. With a click of a button, the email was projected for everyone to see. The subject line read, Exit Strategy Update. The body of the email was damning, detailing their plan to bleed him dry before filing for divorce. A strangled sound escaped from Elena's throat. The sight of her own words, her own treachery, displayed in stark black and white for the entire court to witness, seemed to sever her last connection to rationality. Her composure, so meticulously crafted, shattered like cheap glass. He's lying, she shrieked, jumping to her feet and pointing a trembling, accusing finger at me. He's the liar. He faked those. He doctored them. He's a nobody, a carpenter. He doesn't have any money. This is a trick. He's trying to trick you. Her voice rose in pitch and volume, becoming a hysterical, incoherent tirade. The mask of the sophisticated victim was gone, ripped away to reveal the raw, ugly face of pure, cornered greed. She was a wild animal caught in a trap, and she was thrashing violently, making it worse for herself with every move. "Order!" Judge Albright's voice boomed, the sharp crack of her gavel punctuating the word. "Order in this court. Mrs. Miller, you will sit down and be silent. Your outburst is not helping your case in the slightest." Two bailiffs moved to stand behind Elena's chair, a silent, imposing presence. She sank back into her seat, her body racked with shuddering breaths, her eyes darting around the room, as if looking for an escape that didn't exist. The judge turned her steely gaze on Peterson. "Counselor," she said, her voice dripping with ice, "were you aware of your client's secret account? Were you aware of these communications? Did you have any knowledge of this exit plan?" Peterson looked horrified, his professional reputation flashing before his eyes. "No, Your Honor," he said, his voice shaking. "Absolutely not. I have been misled by my own client. I was presented with a version of the facts that is, it now appears, entirely false." Throughout this entire meltdown, I remained silent. I didn't move. I simply looked at Elena. There was no triumph in my heart, no joy in her destruction. There was only a profound and weary sadness. I looked at this woman I had once loved, this woman I had shared a bed with for 10 years, and I saw a stranger consumed by a hunger so vast it had devoured her soul. She had thrown away our history, our home, her own integrity. She had insulted my father. She had tried to ruin me, all for money. And the ultimate irony was that I had the money she craved all along, but she had never seen the man who held it. She had only ever seen the carpenter. Judge Albright looked from the damning evidence on her desk to the crumbling woman at the petitioner's table. Her decision was swift and brutal. In light of the petitioner's blatant and egregious attempt to defraud her husband and this court, she announced, her voice ringing with authority, this court is making the following rulings. The petitioner's request for spousal support is denied in its entirety and with prejudice. The funds in the secret account, totaling $217,400, are deemed to be misappropriated marital assets. Therefore, I am awarding that full amount, plus statutory penalties for fraud, directly to the respondent, Mr. Thomas Miller. Elena let out a low moan. Her head was in her hands. The judge wasn't finished. "As for the family home," she continued, "the evidence shows the land was inherited by Mr. Miller prior to the marriage, and the house itself was substantially built by his own labor. Given this, and more importantly, given Mrs. Miller's clear and malicious bad faith actions throughout this proceeding, the court declares the home to be the sole and separate property of Mr. Miller. Mrs. Miller will vacate the premises within 48 hours. The finality of the judge's words hung in the air. It was over. Elena let out a sound that was not human. It was a raw, guttural noise of pure despair, half sob, half scream. She collapsed forward, her head hitting the table with a dull thud. Her whole body shook with violent, uncontrolled sobs. Her brother Marcus leaped up from the gallery, his face pale with fury and panic. "This is a travesty," he yelled. "You can't do this." The bailiffs moved instantly, intercepting him before he could approach the table. "Sir, you need to leave the courtroom now," one of them said, his voice firm. Marcus sputtered, but the sight of the officers' hands on their belts seemed to drain the fight out of him. He was escorted out, still shouting incoherently about injustice. Elena was a broken wreck, her expensive suit now rumpled, her perfect makeup ruined by tears, her body heaving with the force of her defeat. She had gambled everything on my perceived weakness, and she had lost everything. The house, the money she had stolen, the alimony she had counted on, all gone. More than that, her reputation, her carefully crafted image, had been publicly and irrevocably shattered. She was no longer the victim. She was the villain, exposed for all to see. Her final public humiliation was complete. As the bailiffs helped a near catatonic Elena to her feet to lead her from the courtroom, her eyes met mine one last time. There was no anger left in them. There was no hatred. There was only a hollow, bottomless void of disbelief and utter desolation. In that moment, I saw the true cost of her greed. She had not only lost a divorce case, she had lost herself. Leaving the courtroom felt like stepping out of a pressure chamber. The normal sounds of the hallway, footsteps, distant conversations, seemed impossibly loud after the tense silence of the hearing. I took a deep breath, the air feeling fresh and clean in my lungs. The weight that I had been carrying for months, for years, had finally been lifted. David clapped a firm, steadying hand on my shoulder. "You did it, Thomas," he said, his voice filled with a quiet satisfaction. "You stayed the course. You let the truth do the work." I could only nod, my throat tight with a surge of emotion I couldn't name. It was relief, but it was more than that. It was vindication. It was the feeling of justice, not as an abstract concept, but as a tangible, physical release. I felt a single tear trace a hot path down my cheek, and I didn't bother to wipe it away. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of pure, unadulterated freedom. My first thought was of my father. I pulled out my phone, my hands shaking slightly, and dialed his number. He picked up on the second ring. He was having a lucid day. I could hear it in the clarity of his voice. "Hello?" he said. "Dad, it's me," I said, my own voice thick. "It's over." "Is everything all right, son?" he asked, a note of concern in his voice. I smiled, a real smile that reached my eyes. "Everything is perfect, Dad. Listen to me. We're going home, back to the house. For good." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then I heard him take a shaky breath. "Oh, Thomas," he said, his voice full of a relief that mirrored my own. "That's good news. That's the best news." The days that followed were a blur of activity. True to the judge's order, Elena vacated the house within 48 hours. She didn't call. She didn't try to see me. A moving company came and took her things, the designer clothes, the expensive furniture she had bought, the art she had chosen for the walls. When I finally walked back into the house, it felt cavernous and empty, stripped of her presence. It was a blank canvas. The consequences for Elena were swift and severe, as David later detailed for me. The court's official finding of fraud was a public record. It destroyed her professional credibility. Her firm, unwilling to be associated with such a scandal, quietly terminated her employment. The social circles she had worked so hard to cultivate turned their backs on her. In their world, losing money was a misfortune, but being publicly exposed as a deceitful failure was an unforgivable sin. She was forced to move into a small spare room in her brother Marcus's condo. She had nothing. She had flown too close to the sun, and her wings of greed and arrogance had melted, sending her crashing back to an earth she no longer recognized. About a week after the hearing, as I was in the process of moving my father's things into the house, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered it anyway. "Thomas?" The voice was so different I almost didn't recognize it. The arrogance, the confidence, the sharp, commanding tone, it was all gone. All that was left was a raw, desperate rasp. It was Elena. I didn't say anything. I just listened. "Thomas." "Please," she began, her voice cracking. I am so sorry. I know I don't deserve it, but I am. I made a terrible, terrible mistake. I wasn't thinking. I was wrong. About everything." She started to sob, the sound thin and pathetic over the phone. "I have nowhere to go, Thomas. He's awful. He blames me for everything. I lost my job. I have nothing. Please, can we just talk? Can I see you? I need help." I listened to her desperate, rambling plea. A year ago, it might have moved me. 6 months ago, it might have made me angry. But now, it stirred nothing in me at all. It was like listening to a broadcast from a distant foreign country. The person on the other end of the line was a stranger to me. The connection was gone. When she finally ran out of words, her sobs subsiding into ragged breaths, I spoke. My voice was calm and final, devoid of hatred or pity. It was simply the voice of a man stating a fact. "There's nothing left to talk about, Elena. I said. You made your choices. You built your life around them. Now I'm making mine. But what am I supposed to do? She cried. That is no longer my concern, I replied, and the words were true. Goodbye, Elena. I ended the call. Then I opened my contacts, found her name, and blocked the number. I blocked Marcus's number as well. I closed the door on that entire chapter of my life. It wasn't an act of anger. It was an act of peace. I was locking the door to a room I never wanted to enter again, and the key was already dissolving into dust. 6 months passed. The harsh lines of winter softened into the gentle blush of spring, and then deepened into the lush green of summer. Life found a new rhythm, a new normal. It was a quiet, peaceful rhythm dictated by the rising sun and the needs of my father. I'm sitting on the front porch of the house I built, a glass of iced tea sweating in my hand. The sun is setting, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. The air is warm and smells of freshly cut grass and the roses my father and I planted along the walkway. Beside me, in a comfortable rocking chair, my father is humming an old, forgotten tune. His eyes are closed, a contented smile on his face. The house is no longer empty. It is full. It is filled with my father's books, which line the shelves I built for them. It is filled with old, framed photographs of my mother, her smile beaming down from the walls. It is filled with the scent of wood oil from my reopened workshop and the aroma of the simple, hearty meals I cook for us. For the first time in a decade, this house feels like a home. It feels like a sanctuary. I spend my days working in my shop, taking on projects I love, not just ones that pay the bills. I have a backlog of orders for custom furniture, my reputation as a craftsman spreading by word of mouth. The work grounds me, connects me to something real and tangible. The rest of my time is for my father. We have good days and bad days, moments of brilliant clarity, and long afternoons lost in the fog of his memory. But through it all, we are together. He is safe. He is loved. He is at peace. I think back on the whirlwind of the past year, on the woman who tried to burn my world to the ground. I realize now that the trust fund, the money my grandfather left me, wasn't my real inheritance. That was just paper. My real inheritance was something far more valuable. It was the integrity my father instilled in me. It was the foresight of a grandfather who understood that true security isn't just about money, but about having the means to protect what you love. It was the strength in my own 2 hands, the ability to build and create and care for things. Elena never understood any of that. She looked at me and saw a man of little value because my worth couldn't be quantified on a bank statement. She saw my hands and saw dirt, not dignity. She saw my love for my father and saw a liability, not a virtue. She was so blinded by her desperate chase for a life that looked good on the outside that she failed to see the quiet, solid richness of the life we could have built together. She thought she was divorcing a poor carpenter, but in reality, she was divorcing a man who was richer than she could ever comprehend in all the ways that truly matter. They say money can't buy happiness. I've learned that's true, but it can buy a certain kind of misery, the kind that comes from believing it is the only thing worth having. It's a poison that rots you from the inside out, leaving you hollow. Elena drank that poison willingly, and it cost her everything. I take a sip of my iced tea and look at my father, who is now sleeping peacefully in his chair, the evening breeze rustling his white hair. I learned the hardest and most valuable lesson of my life. True wealth isn't in a portfolio or a trust fund. It's in the quiet dignity of a good day's work. It's in the comfort you can give to someone you love. It's in the peace that settles in your heart when you know, without a doubt, who you are, especially when everything else has been stripped away. She tried to take everything from me, but in the end, she only succeeded in revealing what I had all along. And for that, in a strange and silent way, I will forever be grateful.